So what we're going to do is, I'm kind of the leader to keep you guys in line and point to the next person, really, because we don't want a bunch of fingers pointing at different people. But we're going to have you kind of have it opened up here for any questions that you have for the panel in general, for any specific one of the speakers. I know John didn't have any questions to his paper, so if anyone wanted to ask any to him first, and then any general questions, please do go ahead.
That's odd.
Please, Andrew.
Well, I'll just start it off since someone else is going to. So just to start with John, since he didn't get an opportunity to have people ask him questions. Gideon, when he's going into battle, God commands that the weak-hearted men are to go back. And Sam kind of made this point about how, if we can't even decipher that women shouldn't be in combat, how can we decipher that certain men shouldn't either? How would you, those men who are weak-hearted, what's their place? Do they disgrace their home when they're felt unfit to fight those men? Gideon.
That's a good question, and I think that this actually this demonstrates how the order of creation extends not just to the civil government as it fights and so forth, but also to other administrative purposes as they rule in any capacity, because there are certain men, especially if Sam Belts were here, if you had to choose pick 3 men who are going to face Goliath, you're going to pick Sam first, and then so on. There are certain men that you're not going to pick. So what is the duty of, say, Travis Birch, who obviously isn't going to get picked to fight? I'm kidding. You were just saying how you make fun of people. Anyway, or President Saunders, for instance, who is, and this isn't a joke, he's older, right? Is he disgracing his wife by not, that's essentially the same question. So I think what it comes down to is, how do those men, whether they be old, feeble, whatever, or just...
I'm a national treasure, you have to preserve it.
Or too precious
You
to...
get a new shovel, a bigger shovel.
Well, what can they do? I think one of the interesting things...
was 80 years old and he was still as strong as he was as a young man.
But for whatever reasons, a man can't. There are other examples of... I was going to say... when women started engaging in any capacity in the armed forces, even before they were in direct combat, that's the newest issue, but this is no new issue as far as women participating. What ended up happening would be that those men who were weak and feeble, who used to support and honor the cause by filling those positions, whether as a mechanic or whether as whatever, they were replaced by women who were seeking equal opportunity, and more frail men were actually forced to go into, I don't have statistics, but they were displaced, whether they were forced to go into battle that they weren't equipped for, or they were just, they had no real place in the military. Now you look at the military, and it's, you have the weak and the strong, the women and the men. It used to be that weak men had a more proper place in facilitating the national cause. You know what I'm saying?
I would answer that question. Do you really need this?
It's being recorded, so it's helpful.
Only those of us who are older.
Oh, old and feeble ears. Okay. I would answer that in terms of vocation. And we could go back to Gilead, where we see that there were those who were men armed for battle. Didn't say all of our men. that only those men armed for battle will go on trans-Jordan then and into the western side of the Jordan River. They left behind their women, their children, their livestock, and so forth. The word for little ones is toph in Hebrew, which means quick, short steps. And the older I get, the shorter my stride gets. I mean, really, my back is not good, and I notice that about people older than me, that they take shorter, quicker steps than I do, just so they don't lose their balance. You wouldn't want me out in front trying to gain what Israel needed to gain. I don't think you'd want me protecting this nation with what's going to be protected better with guys your age. I'm not looking to shuffle off that responsibility on your age men, but in defense of Sam's paper, which I thought was intriguing, it's very intriguing. There are tests that our military goes through today. A, physicals. B, apparently there's some psychological stuff that's done, which sounds like it's shady at best. And so those kind of things, I think, permit a man to be concluded unfit to do what it is that vocation requires. And here's the other half of that. If he were to leave the vocation he's supposed to carry out, which is for the benefit of his neighbor, which closest one is his wife, and then anyone else that's benefits from what he does. And if he were to leave that and go to the military to a vocation that's not his, he would be doing no one any good. So I think John is absolutely right on the mark when he makes that statement.
Yeah, those were some awesome points, and we don't discriminate anymore, as John's paper said, and as many of the things that you've brought up. One part where we haven't discriminated in a long time is what Israel did. Those who had been recently married could not go to war, right? And there have been TV shows on like Army Wives and the like, and you look at the damage that you have a conflict of vocations here, right? And the wife and the newborn children suffer, right? So I think that's also something that maybe we're not bound to the ceremonial or political laws of Israel anymore, but we should take what is good and that which accords to natural law. And I think the breaking up of families and sending men over for 3 or 4 or 5 tours, where their children never get to know who their fathers are, can be very, it's destructive. It destroys the family, which was the whole point of your paper.
Go ahead. A while ago, I was visiting a friend in North Carolina, actually, and he had some members over from his congregation. The husband was a kindergarten teacher. The wife was a cop. It was weird. It's always stuck with me. And it was interesting to watch. I met them that one time, that was it. I don't know how they're doing. But just their interaction in a public setting, going over to a friend's house kind of setting it was weird. And maybe it was just all in my head, but it was very strange. It didn't feel right. I felt wrong about it. And so I thought about that. So I tell my daughters they will not be allowed to be police officers. I don't think they should be cops. I don't think women should be in that station. I don't know if there's any, as it relates, particular, they carry weapons and they're expected to defend people on the front line. It's the message,
I agree with,
but
I think this also speaks to, if we oppose women in combat now, or the draft, conscription of women, well then what do we say to our members? Well, I suppose you say the same thing to your members that you should have been saying before this got so out of hand. You should have been, would you tell a member, well, you can't be a cop, I mean, let's say you get a call to a church and there's a woman who's a cop, and you say, well, that's wrong. I mean, come on. We don't do that, do we? Because, should we? I don't know, maybe I could ask you. I think that what's needed is for them to simply relearn the relationship between man and woman. It's been almost erased. And the only thing that's left is the fact that there is a natural revulsion. You and the rest of everyone else is too polite to voice it. I'm sure you didn't say anything, right?
Of course not.
Everyone sees it. Everyone is at least snickers, because they know it's unnatural. So, for a man to be a kindergarten teacher, no,
It is not the Duma.
it's just, it is a masculine job. Even, not just as far as defending, it's a masculine job to have somebody come to my window and say, do you know how fast you were going? And I said it kind of like, more like a woman. Do you know how fast you were going? I mean, not that every woman cop speaks like that, but it's unbecoming a woman to be executors of the law. That's not, I don't know. That's my way out.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
Just very briefly, this book is called Augustine on War and Military Service, specifically because in Augustine's context, military service would be police. And a lot of what is talked about is domestic, maybe even civil war sometimes, but domestic matters where as military, there's no real break between military and police, as far as I understand it, in that. So that's a fine area of discussion as well.
I think a matter of vital importance here is always focusing on the divinely instituted office of whether in the home or in the civil government. The discussion almost immediately jumps to whether or not women are capable of doing these things, whether physically, emotionally, and of course spiritually is not considered, because that needs to be the ultimate consideration. And nothing should be considered before you do that, right? Who does God place into these callings, and why does He do it that way? What is the basic distinction between male and female? Not are they just able to pass the physical qualifications or the intense psychological training, but what do women do? Who are they? Are they the bearers and nurturers of life, or are they the hardened defenders of life with force if need be? There's a really basic distinction. It gets skipped over too quickly. Got to go back to the basics.
Andrew.
Anyway, this hasn't really explicitly been addressed, and I want to give you guys the chance to be able to talk about this. This is what everyone is going to bring up. What about Deborah and JL? Now, I can say, obviously, Deborah didn't actually fight. So we can clarify that. She didn't actually fight. But could you explain, just to give you guys the opportunity to just talk about this and explain, how does that example, is that a good example? Isn't it, what kind of example does that give to us in our present context?
I'm glad you asked that question. Because that's an important one, right? Yeah, everybody uses Deborah, and you're right. I mean, she doesn't actually fight. She wasn't actually supposed to go up with the military anyways, and she chastises Barak for actually, and she says that the victory won't be his, right? That God will give Sisera into the hands of a woman. Now, Jael is a very interesting case, because what does she actually do? She actually violates her husband's safe conduct and the sort of treaty that the Kenites have with this people. She takes him in under the pretense of taking care of him and hiding him, and then she murders him as he sleeps. It's really a wicked act, really. It is. I don't think there's any way to get around it. Now, did God bring forth good from that evil? Yes, but that still doesn't justify the wickedness of jail. I mean, she violates hospitality laws, which are huge in the Old Testament. You don't treat guests like that. I mean, you know, we laugh about that. And you see parallels of this in Greek society too. So
I can add to that too. What is the repeating refrain of the book of Judges? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Or her.
His or her, sorry. Oh no, I'm not sorry. With Travis's good exegetical foundation of the Old and the New Testament, we're constantly distinguishing between things that are prescriptive and descriptive. The book of Judges is perhaps one of the most sordid chapters in the history of God's people. For this reason, that everyone was viewing himself or herself autonomously. And they were not heeding the godly advice of the prophets. Even when the judges were raised up, some of the judges were evil. And yet God accomplished his will through them. Not to make God the author of evil, or to even say that he sanctions evil, but that he still accomplishes his purpose in a wicked and sinful fallen world, and in a case where the men weren't doing their jobs. So there's the inevitability, right? It needs to be done somehow. And it's a judgment on the men who did not lead, like you said, of Barak, right? He was chastised because he was not being a godly leader as he should have been. And so, if the men don't do it, the women inevitably will. And that doesn't mean it's good at all. It just means that the men are at fault for not doing what they ought to do.
And also one that didn't get brought up and never gets brought up because everybody tends to forget it is the Levite and his concubine. They go to a Benjamite town, and the inhabitants of that city basically do what Sodom wanted to do. They end up raping her to death. And what does the Levite do? He cuts her into pieces and sends the pieces of her body all over Israel. And so they gather and they're like, look, there needs to be punitive measures here. There needs to be the destruction of this town. Well, what does Benjamin do? Well, they fight a defensive war on behalf of this city. Now, we've talked a little bit about defensive war as being a just war. This would violate what some of the other papers have talked about. They fight for an unjust cause, right? And not only does Israel suffer for it, with the great loss of life, but the tribe of Benjamin is almost wiped out. There are only 400 men left, and they don't have any wives. And so they actually have to go and steal wives because everybody promised not to give them any wives. To betroth their daughters, to these men, which goes to show, how very ugly this war was. It was ugly because God tells them to go up, Israel gets beat. God tells them to go up again, Israel gets beat, right? And then finally they do destroy all of the Benjamites, save those 400. So.
I'll see if I can put the best construction on JL. What if, and I don't disagree with what was said here, but what if she was protecting her home?
That's what I thought that too.
The treaty that the husband had made was going to result in Israel wiping them out, chasing Sisera. So, knowing that her home would be destroyed and gone, and her with it, the better act on behalf of the one true God of Israel was to be able to give evidence to Israel that you have no reason to destroy our home. So if that is the case, I'm just saying if that's the case, She was in the military at that moment in time. She was in the Israelite military, a far-reaching exception to the norm. But at that point in time, she put a peg through his head. And she did it as a defender of her home.
Now, could I say something? Okay. Just that I thought that too, and to, if I may, in maybe a little bit of Hegelian fashion, find a synthesis here, which you often do throughout the scriptures. That you often find a just cause mixed with an unjust tactic. So you look at like Abraham and Sarah. Sarah giving Abraham Hagar was a just cause to get fulfill the prophecy of the seed, give Abraham a child. But the tactic, I think we'd all agree, was sinful, and we see this happen throughout. And so I think that, because I thought that too, what you were saying, Pastor Saunders. And I'm still trying to work it out in my mind, because you've mentioned this to me before, what you said there, Travis. And I wonder if it could be both, and even demonstrate that today we see this often, where, Colin was talking about the right intent, which is interesting, which is a whole other question about the whole idea of concupiscence. And so you can't avoid the sin, but we still need to call a thing what it is. When it does come up. So, any discussion on that, elaboration on that?
Well, okay. Did she have, a just intention, right, in killing him? Maybe, I don't know. We're not given that information from Scripture. We do know that the Kenites are descendants of Moses. That they are part of the people of Israel. They were in a bad situation anyways. And by a bad situation, I mean a sinful one. They had allied with Israel's enemies, which was ungodly, right? And sometimes, and I think as Lutherans, we do have the benefit of saying sometimes there really isn't a right action, a completely right action, right? Because we do live in a world of sin, right? Sometimes there is no way but to sin, right? But in that case, we sin boldly, right? Or let your sins be strong, as Luther says, right? She assassinated him. She murdered him. And she did it subtly, right? Under the pretext of actually caring for him. So.
Oh, go ahead.
Just to add one other detail to that is that the intention is very important. Take an example from medicine. The Hippocratic Oath prohibits doing any bodily harm or injury. However, what is surgery? You're cutting someone open. In any other circumstance, that's evil and it's wrong. Nobody is authorized to do that except the surgeon, with the intention of healing the person, of transplanting the organ or sealing up the blood vessel or whatever. So the intention is very important. It's not just to say that the thoughts and the motives, the inner ones that maybe can't be discerned by anyone except for God and perhaps the individual. But it's, again, the office is what's important, right? And that it's used for the right thing, for the goal by which it was instituted. So if Yael does this in order to preserve her home, right, she's defending that office, then it's justified. And I would still say that it is a judgment against the men who failed to do their job, who failed to enter into godly alliances or wage just defensive war. and defend their homes by so doing.
I actually want, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, this is regarding the Magdeburg Confession and Luther's view. We discussed that a little bit, that Luther's view of that a lesser magistrate, or obviously the mob, cannot resist a tyrant, they should flee. Is that correct?
This is Luther saying this?
Yeah, that's what I was going to go for.
The most interesting part, as I mentioned in the paper about the final of the 8 writings, as far as those 10 years of 1531 writing, Luther's warning to the dear German people,
Right.
is that he has really, without exception until then, advocated complete submission to the ultimate earthly authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. What's changed is that he sees that the unjust cause of this war against this impending war against the German people is for the express purpose, so this destroys right intention as a just criterion, for stamping out the gospel, for actually confiscating the scriptures, for actually punishing preachers for proclaiming the truth. And so he sees the unjust cause and unjust authority in the sense that the Pope is instigating the emperor to do this. And that is where, as far as I understand, that the Magdeburg confessors took this, this tradition of Luther, that he advocated lawful defense. And advocated is kind of a strong word, because you heard many qualifications there. He says at various times, if this happens, in other words, the inevitability, not that it's justified, but that it inevitably happens, people defend themselves when they get attacked. That's what happens. That's descriptive. He says it will rest on the consciences of the papacy, not on those who defend their homes against aggression.
Because it was a defense.
Right.
Yeah.
So whether he says, I don't wish to counsel anyone to take up arms against their emperor, but if it comes to this, this is what will happen. Dear Lord, forbid it. We must do everything we can to not let it get to that.
So as a result of that, and Magdeburg being so very, very careful, trying not to set a precedent, even though knowing that it was going to set a precedent, which we saw with Calvin, does that apply, or how does that apply now to the United States? I mean, we obviously don't militarily resist a tyrant. Here, we're not even close to having a tyrant who would be suppressing the gospel. Even then, the gospel is in other, the confessions, the small catechism, true doctrine is in other places. So would we in the United States ever have the right to resist a tyrant?
The Magdeburg Confessions, the confessors of Magdeburg, rather, they make it very clear that every other avenue should be exhausted before taking up arms, and that includes every level of legal action. And so there's many levels before they finally advocate for the magistrates rising up against the superior magistrates. And even that, the understanding with the Holy Roman Empire is that is a just act as well. That is written into the code of the Holy Roman Empire. That is the purpose of the magistrates as well, as to advise and to, if necessary, discipline the superiors. So that they were very much working within the law, as we as Christians in America should as well. That we are not to be lawless, and we are to speak to the government. We are to honor the fourth commandment, or honor our father and mother, which John made an excellent point that is derived from the home. But then it does mean that we are to treat our in the same way that if my father was a terrible human being, I still owe him respect, right? And so in that regard, we don't do it with any kind of joy or anything like that. So yes, it is something that they would advocate much caution over. But the ultimate point that was consistent with Luther, I would actually argue that Luther didn't change at the end there with his, what you said, that at this point the Holy Roman Empire is now trying to stomp out the gospel. I think you could see that. President Saunders and I were talking earlier that Luther defended himself when he hid himself as the knight and Wartburg, right? So there's a certain level of when he had that price on his head, he by all rights should have gone to the executioner. But he appealed to his lesser magistrate, Frederick Weiss protected him, and he took that protection, so.
That'd be fleeing, right?
Right,
Distinguishing between-
yeah, fleeing, but it is still a
Non-violent
defense,
resistance.
right, yeah. And it is a level of defense, it's not just saying, okay, I'll do whatever you say.
I suppose I have a question too. I mean, I think of fleeing this country, calling up Ted Cray and, you know, learning Spanish. But I think the only thing that would really compel me to actually flee, or if need be, because I can't flee without those things which are most important, is if they were to take my children away. And you hear of these horrible cases all over the apostate world. Not the heathen world, the apostate world. Heathen don't do that to their children. I can't say that categorically, but you see it like in Scandinavia. You see it, it's just such a depth of wickedness. And I would kill for my kids. With no concern as to who I need to justify that for. When it comes, not when it comes to this thing, when it comes to them taking them away from the home where the gospel is taught to them. Some couple in Norway, I think it is, and then you find out they're Pentecostal, then you just, no, bummer. But really, it's about the gospel. So in some sense, when the home is subverted and denied, when the office of the father and mother, their rights for their children are denied, in some sense, is this not what we hear of in Acts? You know, it is better to obey God rather than man. Because to let your children go, or to let the home be dictated on such an intimate level, is to obey man rather than God. I would make that argument, and I don't know.
I'll go ahead and quote something from the Magna Confession here. The second level is that of atrocious and notorious injuries, as when a leader from a state or Caesar from an individual leader wishes by unjust violence, contrary to his oath and the laws, to take away life or spouse or children or privilege and sovereignty acquired by inheritance or law. In such a case, since we will say that no one is compelled by the command of God to submit to the usurpation of his own right, so neither will we say that anyone is terrified by the command of God, who himself also bears the office of a magistrate, that he should not use the authority of a magistrate in making the necessary defense. And I think this is in the American context with the Bill of Rights in particular. There is a certain level of just like what John said, that is the legal action that is to be taken. We aren't to bind people's conscience and say you should just let them take your kids. Right? That is absolutely not the case, and that is not that they are breaking the sovereignty of the home. And at that point, now the confessions do say that you can suffer this if you can do so without sin. But I think at the point where you have a situation where the gospel is taken away, you cannot do it without sin. You cannot sit by without sin, and then you are partaking in the crime by your silence and inaction.
I actually had a question for Colin. But I'll allow you guys to answer it.
He's coming back.
It was half a joke and half serious. But when Augustine talks about all of these different ad bellum, in bello ways of whether you can go to war, how you should conduct yourself in war, from what he said, from what you know of the just war theory, as we call it, is there anything that you disagree with or anything that you would add?
Let's come to a quorum or a full agreement before Colin gets back.
It seems to be systematically presented now to us with these certain, criteria of just war and how you act in war. Is there anything that he said that would turn us off, or were we all nodding our heads in agreement to what?
I thought that I already said it to him. He's not here, so it's genuine. I thought it was very well presented paper, and it made me love Augustine all the more.
Yeah.
It is very good. One thing that I disagree with, I don't know. It's similar to the last comment I made, and that is conscription, to force one to go to war and fight for a cause that he finds morally reprehensible, that he identifies as wrong. You know, I don't. Does Augustine? He talks about a duty to fight unless. Yeah. Does Augustine allow for conscientious objection?
What I find, no. He assumes that. I think he assumes that you're never going to know better than the authority what.
He was German.
What the right thing is to be, and even if you have even if you're unsure, because in many cases he says it will be unsure, and if you maybe have an injurious command being given, you can fulfill your duty, and the responsibility is with the one who's giving the evil command. And God is punishing that authority by allowing him to sin in that way. And so there's justice even in that coming to pass.
I get the original question was directed more toward you just because you had done Augustine, is with the just war theory and all of these criteria that you went through, is there anything you disagree with or anything that you would add to this idea of just war theory?
Well, I'm not sure if I don't know if anyone defined the just war theory in its entirety. There's just more things in here that this guy, he's probably a just war expert, and there were things in there that I didn't touch on, and I don't know if we, like probability of success. That was something that was asked about me, asked about Augustine's thinking, and since I promised I would say something about it, I will say that for Augustine, you can never know if God is going to be on your side for victory or if God is going to be on your side to humble you in some way. And so, it's a very theological way of talking about what is our certainty for success. And I guess, and of course with Augustine, he doesn't answer the questions in a just war panel style necessarily, but he would say, hey, it's still a just war if you don't know you're going to win. And it's still a just war if you you can only be a certain level certain, and maybe that's all we can ever say today. But is there anything I would disagree with? Well, I wonder how proportionality fits in with do what needs to be done to win. That was something that I know President Saunders brought up. If you're going to fight the war, you should win. And one phrase I've heard used in that sort of, perhaps in that sort of argument, is overwhelming force. And I wonder how overwhelming force and proportionality in war can be reconciled. If we want to defeat them so that we end the war, but how can we do so matching, what they've already done to us, so that we're not going beyond justice? I don't know if
I think the first
there's an
Iraq
answer.
War might be an example there. That was overwhelming force, but it was restrained. We didn't occupy. We repelled the Iraqi army from Kuwait. We obviously had superior armaments. The war was over very quickly, and I don't know what the total loss of life was. On our side, it was very, very, very minimal loss of life compared to wars in the past.
But then it was over 100,000.
Yeah.
The first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's called collateral damage, but
Yeah, I wasn't sure, I didn't know what the numbers were, but we didn't carpet bomb, as in like carpet bombing Dresden. We hit specific targets. So we had overwhelming force, but we didn't use it, I don't believe, in an overwhelming way. It was much more targeted, much more precise than warfare in the past, where you just unload 20 bombers, the bomber bays of bombs on the civilian population.
And I think that goes in, when you mention civilians, into discrimination and not just proportionality. And I think they go hand in hand. And I guess that's one thing I was thinking about too, is where you had mentioned the, minimum force consistent with military necessity. Well, that word military necessity is quite vague, isn't it? What exactly will be necessary in order to win? And it becomes a policy issue where people debate, and not so much a what is right and what is wrong.
I had a question actually for President Saunders. In just my perusal of a lot of documents before this, I was reading a Martin Charlemagne document on nuclear warfare and just war. Did you by any chance read that or come across anything along those lines as far as with the nuclear warfare, we've entered into a new level of combat where you can't precision strike a nuke. There's a certain level of collateral damage that is going to necessarily happen. And Charlemagne's paper talks a lot about essentially, they have a big sword, we better have a big sword too. This is speaking of nuclear warfare, that preventative deterrence, yeah.
It's like the castle wall of today.
Right. But I was curious if you had come across that.
I didn't read Charlemagne's, but I remember at seminary talking with professors who did know Charlemagne very well. In fact, your grandfather was one of them. And the adage that I mentioned in the paper, power only respects a greater power in the kingdom of the left. It doesn't respect politeness. It doesn't respect precision bombing. This is really, if we want to use a biblical term to address to war, it's called discipline. If a nation is aggressing and wants to expand its borders, it is acting outside of its domain. If a nation is being aggressed upon, and I'll use Pearl Harbor of 1941 as an example, or the other European nations who were being invaded by the Axis powers. Those who are being aggressed upon need to use a greater power than the power that's affecting them. So that's discipline. Discipline has for the purpose of stopping that behavior and threatening that if that behavior has any mind of resurfacing, we will double our power. And if it means eliminating you as a people, that's what it means. So if you don't want that to happen to your people, then don't start the fight. So I'm not an advocate of this precision stuff of war, or sanitizing it, or trying to paint pretty pictures of it. War is bad. And a nation that doesn't want to go into war, has no intention of taking anyone's life, wants to leave their infrastructure the way it is, and leave us alone too, but the enemy is not doing that. The enemy is just killing your people, destroying your infrastructure, a threat to you. Then discipline needs to be carried out. And I don't think there is such a thing as measurability in proportion. The proportion is, I told you not to do it, you did it, now you're going to be punished for doing it.
It's the Chicago way of the untouchables.
It's the Saunders household I grew up in. You misbehave, you're going to get spanked.
Which is
You know,
Chicago way.
But you misbehave, you're going to get spanked. You misbehave, I'm going to hang you outside on a tree. That's true. So I guess the question I would have, because I myself think proportionality and discrimination are both very good part of the act within war.
If part of my misbehavior was killing my sister, then yeah, I would have gotten hung out. So I mean, we're not. Your analogy isn't the same.
Well, I mean, the analogy is just toward your analogy of the household. So the whole point I'm trying to make is we can agree on not wanting to kill civilians. right? Or can we not? Because I wouldn't want to kill civilians in a war, but like you say, you sometimes have to. I think that's the point of Augustine, is that he's thinking more theoretically. You're not intending to kill civilians, but if you have to in order to kill the combatants.
It's an unintended consequence.
Right.
And if you want to avoid the unintended consequence, don't start the fight.
Okay.
If you live as a citizen in a nation where your leadership is bound to do that, then the citizenship needs to step up and change the leadership. So you are connected to your leadership in your nation, whether you want to or not, whether you disagree with their politics or agree with their politics.
Right.
That which they lead your nation into, you are subject to the repercussions.
Even a tyrant.
Absolutely.
Is there some duty, if you have to afflict civilian population in order to harm the enemy and stop him, is there a duty to, like, for instance, if I lived in the United States and there were, or let's say I lived in Wisconsin.
That's one in the United States.
And Wisconsin was aggravating somebody else, and another state. Let's pretend that they're all countries. I would move out of Madison, right? The United States, you know, they bombed Dresden, which had nothing to do with the military or any support of the military, other than the fact that they were there. I mean, is there some duty to have some rhyme and reason as to which civilians? That is likely one of the, that was likely one city where they would have killed the least amount of military personnel. And so I think with things like that, I mean, is the point to just hit them where it hurts to destroy morale? Or, I don't know. I'm just...
Well, that's why I asked the question, is to kind of get this discussion, that, because I think proportionality and discrimination are very, very debated in policy and in wartime decisions by generals and by the commander-in-chief, that this is a part of the just war where Christians are very much disagreeing with each other.
Well, I'll give you an example of two wars that I think may are an example of this. In Dresden, and I'm certainly not an expert in what happened there, but you had within 30 years, you had two attempts by Germany to rule the world.
World?
That was their goal.
No, World War I? No.
Well,
Not the world.
World War II was a result of World War I. And however, World War I was dealt with after that in the 20s and the 30s, and the Great Depression that followed that. But in that respect, the world was just simply tired of Germany doing this. And whatever it was going to take for them to stop doing this, it's what it was going to take. So, you know, whether it was justified in doing it to Dresden, maybe should they done it to Mannheim, should they done it to Berlin, should they done it to a different city? I would not be surprised if the military intention there was to say, this is an example of what's going to happen to your nation should you rise up and try to do this again and cost not only lives but resources and so forth. That would be my guess. And it worked. Now we went to the, what do we call it, the Desert Storm thing, and we say we won. We did not win that. They just simply went and hid. We claimed it as a very quick victory, overwhelming. They were smart enough to go and hide so that we didn't have anybody to shoot, and we got the idea that they weren't going to go to war. As soon as we pulled out, look what comes up. So that might be an example of what happens when you don't do the very thing that says publicly and powerfully, you do this again, and that city will cease to exist. Now that's crass, that's tough, that's difficult, that's inhumane, but that's the result of the fall.
So you don't agree with the proportionality and discrimination then of what Augustine said?
Well, I'm not that well versed on what Augustine says per se.
Okay.
His context would have been far different than what our context is today. We can do a lot of damage in 2 seconds.
So it's hard to apply what he was
I think
saying
so.
to our context.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I disagree with him. I'm just saying in our day and age, whatever it is, whatever malady that caused that war needs to be disciplined. And disciplined in a fashion that that behavior ceases to exist and does not raise its ugly head again.
It's like Sherman's March to the Sea.
He burned them.
Yeah, I mean, they still remember it.
So where the gospel is not going to change hearts, the law has got to frighten hearts. And that's the kingdom of the left.
Yes, follow up that. Regarding Iraq, then we have the second Iraq War, and as far as 2 weeks goes, the military forces of Iraq were defeated. The question is, how do you win a war? What does success look like? Saddam Hussein was overthrown, he was hanged. The government was defeated, the military was defeated. U.S. forces occupied for 10 years, 13, are we still there in some measure? What does success look like? The power vacuum created by that attack and occupation, arguably, was a worse loss than the first Iraq War not going far enough. Because the Islamic State cannot exist without the power vacuum of a weak Iraqi government, which is infiltrated by radical Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda broke ties with the Islamic State because they were too radical. And they were too murderous towards women and children. So the question is, to have total war and to prevent it from happening again, would it be an advisable, justified, or even a pragmatically workable solution in Iraq than to start murdering all of the people, armed or not?
What would we say? Can I talk?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think we live in such a godless mindset. As people have been presenting today, or these past 2 days, I keep thinking about the Enlightenment and how radically this has altered just the scaffolding of our minds. Where we can't even unravel it in our own brains. How differently you can look at the world from a theistic point of view, where God's in control of the world, or is man in control of the world, makes his own destiny, that kind of thing. And the thing about being in a godless world, Machiavelli was the philosopher that said, basically do whatever you have to do in order to win.
I was actually going to bring that up, that actually he says if you conquer a country, there are 3 ways of dealing with it. One is to live in the country yourself. The other is to plant a large colony of your own people there, or exterminate the entire population, so that way you don't have to deal with rebellion and insurrection.
And I think there is such a thing as losing with honor. And we don't want to. I don't know if this is part of the American way or what, but we don't want to be losers. And we think that and I thought this even with the Magdeburg Confession, it's not up to us to see to it that this world continues. And the nation or whomever who loses honorably, it's not like they have ceased to exist as though we're the arbiters of what is reality. God sees it, and if it gets to the point where all godly people die, then Christ is going to come. It's not up to us to perpetuate our own existence, or even to perpetuate that which is good. So in order to justify these sorts of things, we have to live as best we can according to God's commandments,
and God does carry out vengeance. We might not see it, but perhaps, I mean, the worst vengeance, really, is for the wicked man to have success. I mean, that's the worst thing, really, that can happen to him.
Kind of following on that. I mean, you're speaking pretty darn broadly, but if we're speaking of a just war being a defensive war, we have, I mean, that's the point, and we have the right to respond in extreme measures in order to win and to defend our borders. So the question was kind of brought up a couple times in passing. Does a sovereign nation have the authority to get militarily involved in a war in which they have no allied agreement and their homeland, their border is not in danger? We see an unjust war happening, and then the unjust people win. And yet we have no connection, we have no resources. We could probably make something up because we're a superpower, but would we have the right to get involved?
Luther says no. Let's say more than that too. Pragmatically, let's say that the United States does have the authority and the right and also the necessity then of punishing evil in other countries, such as part of the justification to invade Iraq was the gassing of the Kurds in 1988. Of course, that's quite a delayed response to invade and occupy in 2003, but should it be their duty, why is it not also the duty of the United States to attack Boko Haram in Nigeria? Why is it not also their duty to attack the warlords of Somalia? And why is it not their duty to occupy Ukraine? And why should they not be preventing evil and wholesale destruction of innocent human life all over the world? But imagine the chaos if every nation thought that way and intervened in the evil affairs. For example, if we invaded China in order to stop their mass slaughter of unborn children. It's an evil. It must be stopped. Whose duty is it to do that? The chaos that would ensue from each country seeking to manage the world is unthinkable, especially right in this age of weapons of mass destruction, where a few seconds can wipe out entire populations.
I think this also, like what I said in my paper, you can't impose liberty. You can execute justice, and if you want to influence, the best way you can influence is see to your own affairs. Make sure that your own house is established correctly. But no, Alex is absolutely right in that regard. I mean, this is the dilemma of Superman. He's fast as lightning, but he's not omnipresent, and he's overcome, but I'm not going to psychologize Superman too much. But, obviously that was commentary on Superman itself. The comic was commentary on America's rising status as kind of an enforcing power. We have duty because we're good. But what is goodness? What is the goodness of a nation? The goodness of a nation is found in its constituent parts. We can also influence. I mean, right now, if we actually wanted to outlaw abortion as a country, and then say, in China, you should too. What are you going to do? Well, we're not going to trade with you anymore. And you know that because our house is so unbelievably well ordered. We're pretending here for the sake of example. Because of that, we have economic success, and you're going to be hurt. You can do that. I think that's a more just way to retaliate and try to affect justice in the world.
Yeah. That is also how the Magdeburg Confession writers would have spoken to it as well, is that it's an appropriate response without usurping. It's not becoming a greater tyrant, where if I'm going to say this is how you ought to behave, I become a greater tyrant than Kim Jong-un, so it's...
Yeah, and I mean, the desire to do good and to right wrongs, I mean, it's a good and pious desire. I mean, most of us feel this as pastors looking at our congregation when we see the spiritual neglect of other people's children. And there are sometimes you'd love to just kick down the door, take their kids and raise them as your own. but that's not given us to do, right? And it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking that these parents neglect their children in the most important way, but that God has not given me that responsibility to raise somebody else's child. And He doesn't give magistrates of this country authority to go and right the wrongs in other countries.
That was for everybody. That wasn't just for.
It went to
We're gonna have to.
Travis gets the last word.
You can say some if you'd like, but we're gonna have to stop here and then have Vespers.
This is all it is besides our kids and wives.
Yeah. Yep.
2:30.
I figure. Yeah.
2:30.
Could I ask one last question?
Yeah.
I don't want any answers. I wanted to end with a question. Is that okay? Our Lord Jesus. The genie may have a second wish, please. Our Lord Jesus is very clear when He says to turn the other cheek, not to resist evil, to pray for your enemy, love those who persecute you. The early Christians suffered all, even death. In other words, once they had fled a certain amount, there came a time when they just allowed themselves to die. When and where should we do that? I ask this because a member asked, may I bring a concealed carry weapon to the church in case someone comes and opens fire? When and where, if ever? There's got to be, and it's sad to me that we have to say, well, we're trying to find this tiny parcel of space in our lives where we can obey the command of Christ not to resist evil. Where and when will we be persecuted without resisting?